1, 2.
They're still in, I think. If you guys can't find seats, it's going to be piped in here too.
Oh, okay.
Audio and video. There are a few seats in between if you want to find one.
I hate to get people thank you.
Our dinner party was complaining about that last night.
I would just go ahead and start.
I'll ask the panel to take a seat.
There are no more seats left. You can sit in that room. And we'll pipe
I
in
did.
video and audio.
We don't overlap
And
too
we'll
much.
switch drink bags.
Yours is perfect. I'm gonna keep it short. Yeah. I
Test,
think,
test.
is your mic on, or does he have us muted? Okay.
Mic is on, but it's not up.
Okay. I'll ask.
Should we start?
Yeah, I just told him to turn it on. Testing. Can you hear me? No. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you hear me back there? Hi.
No. I don't have a glass, so I can't take it.
Do you want this? I haven't.
Doesn't work very well.
Okay, I think we're about ready to get started. The panel is here. Okay, if we could just have your attention, we'll get started. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I am Paul Peterson. I'm the director of the program on education policy and governance here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and it's just thrilling to me to see so many of you here with us right on time. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for proving that we are maintaining the momentum. That's the theme of our conference this year, and one of the things we're trying to do to keep the momentum going is we're going to have more sessions than we've had in the past, and we're going to have things happening in 2 places instead of just one. So we're doing our part, we hope, to help maintain the momentum, which is certainly out there in American education, and providing people with many more options and choices than ever before. And it's reminding me that we are approaching the 250th anniversary of the uprising that occurred here, not 25 miles away, in Concord, Massachusetts, and that all led before too long to the Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed every citizen's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And certainly part of that promise is that a child shall have a choice of school, that parents shall have a choice of school, that families can educate their children as they see fit. So to achieve that, it seems to me, to maintain the momentum, it seems to me that we need to have a big tent. We have to embrace all forms of choice. We have to recognize that if we can introduce choice into our public school system, we will be better off as a country. And we're going to have a speaker this evening, or late this afternoon, Alberto Carvalho, the superintendent of the Unified School District in Los Angeles, to speak to that particular proposition. So one of the ways that we want to foster choice is within our traditional public school system, whether it be your district-run schools or the charter schools that are also becoming a big part of the landscape in our public school sector. But we also need to expand choice in the private sector, whether that means providing more school vouchers for people, tax credits that go to individuals or businesses that can be used for fellowships for students, or education savings accounts, which is going to be a topic that we're going to provide, that we're going to discuss at one of the panels today. So we are looking forward here to fostering school choice in multiple dimensions to maintain the momentum. And before we begin, I just have to thank some of those who have made this possible. Certainly we have to thank the Stand Together Trust and Lisa Snell, who's here the first panel, for all of the support they have provided, as well as the support that we have received from the Charles Koch Foundation. And we want to thank EdChoice and Robert Enlow, especially the director. He's not here with us today, but he's been a strong supporter of our program in the past and currently, and we all get to have dinner on him tonight. So we're going to have two sessions. After this first opening session, we're going to have a session in the adjacent room over here, as well as in here. You can have your choice. You can go to panel A or B. This particular panel will be the one in this room. The NI room will be the one that will be available online to our online audience. I think we're going to have a substantial online audience that will be at least as large as the one that is present in the space, and then it'll be recorded and it'll be up online. And that will also be true of the session that's in the adjacent room, the dining room over here, that it won't go up immediately. It isn't simultaneous, but it will go up after the conclusion of the conference. So I also have to thank our staff that's been so critical for making sure that everything happens smoothly. And so here's Antonio Wendland. Is everybody else busy or Yeah, everybody else is busy, but yeah, there's a lot of work behind the scenes that took place in order to make this possible. But Antonio, do you have anything to say?
Yes, if everybody could take out their cell phones right now and silence them, that would be terrific. We do have breaks. We do switch rooms. Try to figure out where you want to be ahead of time if it's possible. There should be enough space for everybody. The refreshments are outside. Services are out here as well. When we conclude, for those of you who signed up for our dinner, it's next door at the Charles Hotel in the ballroom. There is a meet and greet from 6 to 7, and the plated dinner starts at 7 o'clock. 5 o'clock, we will have our keynote, and it will be here. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Antonio. So we're going to try to move quickly. We're going to move on time. We're not going to do long introductions. Long introductions can slow down a conference. We have bios in the handouts that you have, so you can find out all the wonderful things that everybody on our panels has done in their lives. And that begins with the co-moderator, Daniel Hamlin, who is a professor of education policy at the University of Oklahoma. He's a leading contributor to the growing research on educational alternatives, chartering a new terrain, whether it be hyperschools or alt schools or homeschooling or many other forms of education. His latest work is on mass shootings, and we just did a podcast this week. I encourage you to listen to the Education Exchange podcast, where we've talked about the ways to prevent that based on Daniel's research. So I'm really grateful that Daniel, again this year, has played a key role in making sure this conference is successful, and he will be the co-moderator. He will lead one of the sessions, and I will be leading the other. And so, Daniel, would you introduce our panel?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Of course, welcome to everyone here. For this is our third annual conference now. I've really come to look forward to coming to this conference because I know I'm going to learn a ton and really meet a lot of people here who are doing some very innovative things, rethinking K-12 education all over the country, really. So I think it's an exciting opportunity. Paul talked a little bit about our growth, but I want to put a little bit of numbers on it, put a little bit of context to that. So our first year when we started 3 years ago, I think we had about 100 in-person attendees here, and then last year we had well over 300 people attend in person, and I think we had about 1,000 people attend online. This year, I don't know if I'm allowed to say the actual number because we might be over capacity, so I'll withhold that. But we're well over capacity, well exceeded our in-person numbers. We actually, although we didn't want to do this, we actually had to direct 300 people to attend online, although those people wanted to be here in person. So I think we have about 1,000 some odd people also watching online. So if the conference is any indicator of interest, there certainly seems to be a lot of interest in these topics, which is great. Paul already mentioned it, but I'll just kind of reiterate. We have the two rooms, and I think a large part of our reasoning behind having the two parallel sessions is, yes, we can cover more ground and tailor interest a little bit more, but we also think it's going to increase the interaction and engagement with different groups of people in the audience and the panelists. So we want to try to engage you as much as possible. So each session is designed where the panelists will have about 8 to 10 minutes to deliver their opening remarks. And then from there, Paul or I, as the moderators, will pose 1 or 2 follow-up questions. And then we have about half the session that's left aside for audience Q&A. So we certainly want to hear from you in the upcoming sessions. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and jump in. Paul said keep it short. We don't want to have long, drawn-out explanations, so I'm going to stick to that. So why don't we go ahead and pivot to our first session, and it's titled, What's the Growth Potential of Emerging School Models? And on the panel, we have Mike McShane. He's Director of National Research at EdChoice. And then we also have Lisa Snell. She is Senior Fellow at Stand Together Trust. And then finally, Michael Petrilli, who's President of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. So thank you to the panelists. And why don't I go ahead and turn the floor over to you. Mike, I think you're going to go first, right? Yes. And is your clicker working? It is not. Okay, so mine is working.
Yours is
Here you go. All right. All right, thank you.
Just what you want to hear right before you start talking is we've broken attendance records, and B, your clicker doesn't work. So God bless y'all. Well, it's great to be here with all of you today. So Dan actually asked me to sort of set up this conversation. We're obviously looking at the future of these alternative educational models, what the growth potential might be, but sort of in order to know where we're going, it's helpful to know where we are and where we've been. And there's lots of questions we have, like how many students are enrolled in these different models? How many of these different models, whether we were talking about micro schools or hybrid homeschools or others, how many of those exist? Now, I don't know if it's great for me to raise those questions at the beginning of my talk, because in 8 to 10 minutes, I don't know how much closer we will be to an answer. But I'm certainly going to offer you the best numbers that we have, some stuff that we've collected here at EdChoice and others have collected that we can maybe, with some back of the envelope kind of squinting at and guessing, we might be able to answer some of these questions. So we can just start with the big picture of enrollment patterns in America. This is something we compute at EdChoice. We call it the EdChoice share because we're good at branding. And I should say this is available on our website with all of the sources and everything that's there, so you can dig into the numbers. We put it all online. But from what we see, kind of big picture, just south of 75% of American school children attend a traditional public school. 6.8% attend private school. We don't have necessarily a great term for this, so we say self-pay, but this is what we think of sort of as traditional enrollment. Some of those kids are on scholarships that are provided by schools. Some are doing work-study programs or what have you, but sort of traditional private school enrollment. 6.6% attend a charter school. A little south of 5% attend a magnet school. Same 4.7% are homeschooled. This is based off the great research by Angela Watson, who's here from Johns Hopkins, who you'll have the opportunity to talk to later. I told her ahead of time, if any of these numbers, if anybody says anything's wrong, it's my fault, it's not yours. So this was, you take the credit, I'll take the fall. But so about 4.7% are homeschooled, and just under 2% use some sort of educational choice program to attend a private school. So that's big picture in the country. If we look at what this looks like over time, I went ahead and took away the public school enrollment because that would sort of compress the graph and make it harder to read. But if we see for the past 20 years or so, the proportion of American school children that are attending private school, sort of tuition-paying private schooling, has been on a pretty steady, small but steady decline. Charter schooling, we've seen, has made small but steady, or actually probably substantial increases over that time period. Magnet schooling, with some fluctuations there at the beginning, but remaining relatively constant. Homeschooling, while seeing a small amount of growth, really kind of plateaued for a long time, was even on a bit of a downtick before the pandemic, before we saw a massive uptick in what we've seen. Obviously, educational choice, small but mighty, not unlike myself, was growing there until, again, a sort of post-pandemic increase. And I'll say the data that we have always on virtual education isn't great, but that's sort of what we see there. Now, one of the things that we also do with our EdChoice share is we break it down by state. I won't do all 50 here because I only have 8 minutes. But just some quick things. Like I said, this is all available on our website. You can look up your own state to see. But this is a state like Arizona. This does include the traditional public schooling. So we see growth in charter schooling that took place there, and more recently growth in educational choice programs, relatively small homeschooling and other private schooling populations. This is the great state of Florida. Again, what we see is sort of declining in traditional public school enrollment, really strong growth there in magnet schools. See a large, I know we've got a lot of folks from Florida there that this isn't going to be news to, but a strong percentage of students attend magnet schools, strong percentage in charter schools, and then again, sort of recent times seeing increases in educational choice programs. If we want to sort of control, we think of Arizona and Florida as states that have done a lot with respect to private school choice programs. If we'd like a kind of control case, we have where we are currently. We can look at Massachusetts, and what you see is really actually quite steady proportions of students that are enrolled in traditional public schools, quite steady enrollment in tuition-paying private schooling. Massachusetts does actually have data on inter-district public choice, so students going from one district to another. I would love to have that going back like in Arizona, because I know it's super popular there and would definitely change what that graph looks like. But that's at least what we're seeing here. So look, this is broad strokes and driving down to particular states. But as I said at the beginning, one of these questions that we're really interested in is how many students are enrolled in these new models, new educational models, one of which is micro schools. So we at EdChoice every month poll a nationally representative sample of Americans. We oversample parents in partnership with Morning Consult. You'll probably be seeing a lot of their work in the next couple of weeks, a polling firm. So we do this every month, and periodically, because we're interested in this question, how many kids are enrolled in micro schools, we did a crazy thing and we asked the parents that we survey. And so we said this, we did a split sample for reasons I'm about to explain. But so micro schools are small learning environments in K-12 education, enrolling no more than 25 students. Do you currently have a child enrolled in a micro school? When we last asked this question in May, 13% of parents said that they did. Now, if you remember back to that first slide, about 6.5% of Americans send their kids to private school fee paying, about 6.5% are in charter schools. So if this number is correct, it would mean that the sector is basically the size of charter schooling and private schooling combined, which makes me think this number is not in fact correct. So what we've been doing, and this has been, we've asked this a few times before, and we've gotten anywhere 10, 11, 12, 13%. And so what we think is we probably keep getting the question wrong. So you can see we did a split sample this month where we tried to give more of an explanation of what a micro school is. In some of our early experiments where we played with the language, it seemed like some parents who were sending their kids to like after school programs or tutoring programs were answering yes. So we're trying to tease out the primary source of learning for your child. Are you enrolled in? That knocked it down to about 9%, but it was also pretty wordy, and it's possible that they got kind of lost there. 9% still strikes me as as insanely high. I don't think that that's the case. So we're still working, and I know we've got some great folks in the room that we've reached out to. Every couple of months, we try a new question, we try the wording a little bit differently. But like I said, I don't think we're giving it the old college try, but I don't think we're there yet. But one thing that I do want, some great research done by our humble moderator here today, and Albert Cheng of the University of Arkansas, go Hogs, was a paper that they came out with last year that I think is actually informative to the question that they have. So they used the National Household Education Survey, which is a survey given to a representative sample of American families, and asked them a detailed battery of questions about their schooling experiences. And actually really cool, for the even sort of separating out the private schooling or traditional public schooling, it asked a series of questions that drilled down about the experiences sort of within that sector. And what you see here is each of these decimals are really just sort of percentages, right? So this is amongst the people who said that they homeschooled, and again, this is the multiple waves, 2012, 16, 19. So 47% in 2012 of homeschooling families said that they used a private tutor or belonged to a homeschool cooperative. So this answer, so how many are using online instruction? How many are doing sort of part-time instruction that's there? I think actually the interesting one is type 4, which uses no educational supplements. And in some way, that's the sort of stereotypical homeschooler that doesn't use any sort of outside educational resources. And if you look at the kind of inverse of that, that tells you the percentage of homeschoolers that are doing something outside of the home in one of these types of models, whether it's a cooperative, whether it's online instruction. So like I said, well, we don't necessarily have hard and fast numbers. If we combine these percentages with that first slide that I gave, right, where if we're about 4.7% of families are homeschooling, and let's say half of them are in a co-op, okay, well, that kind of gives us an indication, or about half are going to school part-time. Like I said, we can do a sort of back-of-the-envelope estimate of what's happening there, but that's probably the best that I'm able to do right now. And I think I'll stop there and hand it off.
So I guess I'll start, because we're having an awkward silence without direction, an unschooling moment, perhaps. So, I mean, one of the things I would say, reacting to Mike's data, is I think we are in this emerging market that's a new frontier that we don't have very good indicators for, because if you triangulate some of this with things like declines in enrollment, student absenteeism, there's kind of emerging signals that kids are doing a lot of different things, and I'm not sure like the traditional ways that we've been capturing the numbers reflect the entire market. So I'll say that to start as one reaction. And then I think the other important thing that I would want to add to the conversation is this emerging market is very dynamic. It doesn't look the same as the kind of traditional inflection points where you pick a school when your child is going into kindergarten, and then you pick another school in middle school. And because really, K-12 education traditionally has very few inflection points, right? I mean, unless somebody's in a military family, or they have their father's a traveling salesman, or they have reason to move. And I know in some populations, mobility is an issue, but traditionally across the United States, we make these big decisions just a few times compared to like going to a restaurant, right? Or where you're gonna go on vacation, or lots of other life decisions. There's fewer inflection points for families. And the switching costs are much higher than most other things, right? Like there's a lot of switching costs. And so I'd like to make the argument, though, that that is starting to change, and that is because of the broader emerging economic trends in the United States, and a few of those I'll just touch on. One of them is just lifestyle changes in terms of how parents are working. So things like, you know, Zoom meetings and remote work and the peer-to-peer economy. I mean, if you look at the rise in entrepreneurship right now, it kind of reflects the rise in entrepreneurship and education. Micro-entrepreneurship, especially with businesses with fewer than 10 employees, and then micro-entrepreneurship, where people are self-employed and they are their only employees, so people have businesses on Posh, or, you know, they are doing traditional like rideshare. So there is this lifestyle change that's happening where people have a lot more flexibility, and of course it's not everyone, but I would argue that that's probably going to accelerate with things like AI, and that we're just starting to scratch the surface of the future of how people work. And so we're probably not going back to everybody having to be in person in a location. And so we're starting, barely starting to serve for the issue of labor costs and childcare costs that school, in addition to education, is traditionally solved for. And we're doing it in really community-based, innovative ways. So I would just make that argument about lifestyles. And then I would lean into like the data about entrepreneurship. And I know Carrie McDonald has a new book that's coming out in the, I'm not sure the exact date, but in the next few months. And it's gonna go into this in much more detail. So I'd highly recommend you check that out about entrepreneurship and how it's related to education entrepreneurship. And then finally, the third point I'll make in terms of sustainability that kind of goes with these new emerging lifestyle trends is that people are doing education in a much more peer-to-peer way, like other industries. So between the educator and the families directly, without the middlemen of schools, districts, even co-ops, there's just a lot of emerging direct educator to family contact where they're making their own arrangements in community. And I predict that that will accelerate. And they're doing it in ways that are very low cost. And so I know James Tooley has been doing a lot of research in America and in the United States, and we're gonna hear more about that. But literally, when you think about how things traditionally scale, this new education emerging market has a very wide trajectory of different ways that scale can look. So on the one hand, you do have your name brand folks that you might, some people are in the room, the Kaipods of the world, that are building cohorts of educators that will open new schools in still very unconventional, but closer to a traditional model of scale. But you also have, if you look at Eric Warren's work in his hybrid homeschooling project at Kennesaw State, you have tons of folks that are never planning to go beyond their community, right? Like they're solving for their community, and yet they've opened these homeschooling co-ops that, unlike the micro school, some of them have 300 students in the community, 500 students that are going part-time to a homeschooling co-op, which looks, you know, maybe 1 or 2 days a week. And EdChoice actually has an interesting slide on this, going back to the research you were talking about, Mike, where they ask families how many days a week do they want their kids to go to school. And they say less than 5, right? And depending on how you ask the question, part-time school is very popular with parents. And there's been a bunch of scolding articles. One was just in the 74 about like parents are the problem with absenteeism. And yes, parents are the problem with absenteeism. Absolutely. And part of this is this unaddressed kind of lifestyle change that's happening across the board. And then the other final thing that I'll just say about that is the way that these models are priced. Yes, education savings account and the year of universal school choice has definitely helped accelerate this, but this market is growing in California, Oregon, Kansas. There was just a story about the growth in private school enrollment in Boston and how it's gone up to 25% in the last 12 months. So this is happening. These markets are emerging in places that do not have traditional subsidies, whether it's charter schools or ESAs or school choice. And one of the ways they're doing that is that when they are small, they may charge a parent $100 a month, and if they have 300 parents that will pay $100 a month for a homeschooling co-op, that is very affordable. Or even a micro school where they exchange parent labor or kinds of in exchange for keeping the costs low. Now, there's still traditional micro schools that are very expensive, but the point is the pricing model is all over the map, and people, again, are doing it in peer-to-peer ways that don't look like the traditional we're going to pay, you know, $10,000, $12,000, $25,000 in tuition a year. And they're doing it, and it's hard to capture that, going back to Mike's point about the data, but I think all of these trends will continue to sustain and accelerate as our lifestyles are changed by technology and our work habits, and we actually want to spend more time with our kids and our family. And I'll just stop there.
Great. That was great. Well, first of all, it's a real honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I don't know about all of you, but it's pretty special getting to come up to Harvard and tell my sons I'm speaking at Harvard today. That does sound better than downtown in D.C., which is what they hear more often. So thank you for that. And really interesting slides and presentation, Mike. Just a couple of things, and then I'm going to save most of my time for I think some Q&A pieces. But one. To put a little bit of I guess to be somewhat sober on this, and that may be my role, I think, today in many ways. I'm the yes, but guy today. Yes, but. Yes, there's a lot of interesting growth, but we're looking at percentages, right, of the overall market share. And what we also know is that the overall share is declining and declining fast, right? That we are in an enrollment crunch and crisis in America, just like many countries around the world. We do not have enough kids to go around. This has been a topic of discussion as of late. I will try to discuss it perhaps better than some of our candidates have out there in the society. So we won't be talking about cats or dogs in any context. Or any context. Or, yes, I'm just digging myself into a bigger and bigger hole on that.
Only children.
Only children, okay. We, as the Bellwether Education came out with the report yesterday, they had a chart that was really striking. Over the last decade, the number of babies being born in America is down 14%. 14%. I think if you go back a little bit more to 2007, which was the high point of births in America ever in history, we're down 15%. Those kids who were born in 2007, I've got one of them, my older son, Nico. They are now juniors and seniors in high school. Okay, so that means every year after them, the cohorts are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And, a lot of people thought, well, this was going to happen with the Great Recession. We certainly can look in our history books and know during the Great Depression that the birth rates plummeted. But then we know after the Great Depression, they came back, roaring back with the baby boom. That has not ever happened, right? Instead of having a comeback, it just gets smaller and smaller, that cohort. So, if you look at a 14% decline in a decade, that means, not surprisingly, we've got way too many schools all over this country. It's a little uneven. Some places are hit harder than others. There's, in-state, there's the migration within the United States. As Lisa said, some of the changing ways people are working or living is going to have an impact, with the pandemic and Zoom, and people not needing to maybe commute in every day. Perhaps people move to the suburbs or the exurbs and stay there. Maybe they move out of the cities sooner than they would have. So, you've got some big cities where, they're saying in LA, we can ask our keynote speaker today about this, that they are predicting 30% decline in enrollment. 30%. So I think we have to keep that in context in mind, because obviously that means, fewer kids to serve. That means competition is harder for all of these different providers out there. And it also means the politics are a lot harder, right? That when places are growing, it's easier to expand choice. There was no surprise that Arizona in those early days of the charter school movement became quickly the state with by far the largest charter market. Well, Arizona was growing like gangbusters, and they desperately needed schools, and they couldn't build them fast enough, right? And so the public school systems were so upset if there were charter schools taking some of that pressure off. The enrollment increases. Works out very differently when everything's going in a different direction. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And then the other piece is just the blurring of lines, I think, is really interesting. It's so hard. And, Lisa's talking about, all these different kinds of markets and providers. I quipped once with some friends that, those of us even with kids in public schools, that we're all homeschoolers, like maybe not from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday through Friday, 180 days a year, but all the rest of the time, we are finding stuff for our kids to do and enrichment and tutoring. We have seen that market go bananas, right? People spending, in some cases, $10,000, $11,000, $12,000 among the affluent for all that stuff beyond school. And so I think that's also something to keep in mind. And as we start talking about some of the policy implications, I think we should think about that market somewhat differently than we do for the sort of regular school market. So for example, should we talk about enrichment savings accounts that might try to provide opportunities for lower income families to be able to afford some of those things after school on the weekends during the summer, money that shouldn't come out of the regular funding system because that's not where it comes from today, but is that something that we might, and that's something we might come back to.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So just to get the conversation started, let me ask each member of the panel what they think all the shrinkage is going to do that Michael talked about, what all this shrinkage is going to do for these alternative models that we're talking about. Is this going to have an impact? The nice thing about homeschooling is you can downsize pretty quickly. Fewer kids, fewer parents, fewer homeschoolers. So it's a very adjustable market. So is this a problem for the district schools, for Los Angeles perhaps, but really it's not a problem for this particular market? Or is it? You could argue that maybe the other sectors are going to try to regulate this market out of existence. So they have to worry about this as well. So let's start with Mike, and then we'll put down the line. Yeah.
If you guys could call, Irish Mike or Italian Mike, that would be helpful. That would be, no, just kidding.
In Boston,
Irish
Mike, we're going to have to be more specific here, guys. Look, I think what you ended with there is important. I think of two ways of thinking about it. One is the sort of political economy of it, and one is the actual kind of nuts and bolts of operating these things. And I agree, and it's the same point I think that you made earlier, Mike, that declining enrollments, I think a lot of these states, so I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri, about, what would that have been? I hate to say, oh God, it's almost like 15 years ago. I want to say it was like 5 years ago because it betrays my age. But they went through a right sizing, a delightful euphemism for having to close a bunch of schools, and it was awful. I mean, and Kansas City has had incredible enrollment declines. I think its peak had 70,000 kids, and now it's got about 14,000 kids enrolled in its public school district. So as you might imagine, they had to close a lot of schools, and in typical fashion, they weren't sort of closed slowly but surely to minimize the pain. It was wait until the pain is sort of unfathomable and then close a bunch of schools at once. I know Chicago's in conversations to have this, as you're mentioning those, and I think that discussions around anything else, hey, we want to do this new thing, or we want something else going on while schools are closing down. Look, and part of this happened, as we've heard, even within the private schooling sector. I come from a background in Catholic schools, and going into dioceses and archdioceses across the country as new private school choice programs starting up and saying, hey, we have this opportunity. We could start new schools. We could do different things. They were in such a mindset of closing schools down, and so many, they're like, whoa, we're trying to figure out, we got 3 schools we have to close next week or next year. All of this stuff sounds great, but that kind of mindset can really make it challenging to do other stuff. Now, the second piece of it, so that's the political side. I think the actual operation of these schools, I mean, I tend to think that some of these declining enrollments, and we have with pension contributions and all these things that are happening, are actually going to push, we're going to have to do more stuff like this. The existing model just isn't going to work. So I think there was going to actually be more of a push in that direction out of necessity. Whereas right now it's out of interest or opportunity. I think that that's something that we're actually going to have to, there's going to be strong pressure to have more of those options.
Mike, could you talk a little bit more about the share? So I understand enrollments overall are going down, but the number for private, or the percentage for private school students, I think you had 6%.
Yes.
Which some might say that seems kind of low.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because the share that of the total enrollments that private schools are capturing that you had on that screen seems quite lower than it was even just 10 years ago.
Yeah, we saw from the decline, actually, I can probably pop that. Let's see. Oh, wait, which one is it? This one? There we go. Yeah, so now you want to probably combine that bottom purple line with the top yellow line, because that's the students that are attending private school via choice programs plus the students who are attending private schools on their own. But I think even if you put those numbers together, you probably, in the latest data we have, are back to where we were in 04, 05. So yeah, I mean, I think we've seen a steady decline there. So if it's a smaller number as well as a smaller percentage of that number, it's a smaller number.
Should that surprise us given the expansion of private school choice programs? I mean, I guess we would expect to see a rising share.
Well, so they have to, in some cases, and especially with existing private schools, as these programs grow, they have to have something to choose. And I think in the past, again, coming from more of a Catholic school background, there used to be lots and lots and lots of urban Catholic schools, predominantly serving low and middle income families. Over the course of this time period and the 10 or 15 years before that, we saw massive closures of so many of those. And so there were just fewer options for those people to be able to attend. So I think, and I'm hopeful that as more of these programs emerge, that existing schools will be able to fill to capacity and new schools will be able to emerge. But we're missing a whole lot of seats that existed in the mid-90s and the mid-80s and all the way back to the 1960s.
Yeah, and I think if you look at that chart, you see where a lot of those went, and it went to charter schools, as a new study that just came out, shows. So as a charter guy, I feel kind of guilty. Well, again, I'm also Catholic, so that's it. So the guilt, but yeah. But no, I mean that certainly that the charter schools took a big chunk of that share, and now we'll see in some of these states that have, much more generously funded private school choice programs, whether they'll maybe earn some of that share back.
Well, Lisa, do you have a comment?
Sure. I mean, two things. First, I think the new models that are lower cost are actually allowing Catholic schools, Christian schools, all different classical schools, certainly. A lot of these schools that lost market share are coming back at a more low cost point where they're able to start smaller school networks. So one of the things at Stand Together Trust we've been looking at is just all the ways that educators can actually go to these places that are incubating new school models. But it doesn't look like your very high cost, we need to invest, several $1 million in a building and have a startup, even the charter school model. And I really think that is what is unsustainable, right? As we move to this shrinkage, what we are going to have to revisit is pension costs and these districts. And, there's been a lot of evidence from Margaret Rosa at Edgenomics and other places that teachers and educators, as the cost of public education has grown, have really gotten a smaller share compared to administrative costs and other kinds of growing costs. And they're not actually going to teachers' salaries. And I think that is in favor of this new emerging market, because the teachers actually can have a sustainable living and they can set the terms in a way they haven't been able to in these traditional systems. And then the final thing I'll say about Mike's talk about the decline of enrollment is it's not just in general the number of babies that are being born, but it's also the way that the family structure looks. So families are much smaller. And there's a ton of evidence that people that have the 1.2 kid, right, the 2% of a person, that they actually spend a lot more money and are much more engaged on their child's education. And so I think that point goes to the lifestyle. Like, whether we like it or not, as people have smaller families, they're able to give a lot more attention to the education of their kids, and their resources aren't stretched as thin. And that's actually a point, I think, in favor of this emerging new market.
So I do want to open it up for audience Q&A, but I just want to briefly return to the session question here for a moment. So the growth potential of emerging school models, when you think about hybrid homeschooling, micro schools. I mean, what do you see as the growth potential then? Because it seems that for some outsiders that homeschooling, hybrid homeschooling, micro schools even, that's a big lift on some parents, and in some cases may require a pretty standard two-parent family, maybe even one parent not to be working. So how much of the market, let's say, can we expect emerging school models to be able to capture?
So I'll answer it sort of broadly and then more narrowly. But broadly, whenever I think about this looking forward, I think about push factors and pull factors, right? Which is going to drive this. And so if I think of push factors, which is what is pushing families out of traditional schools and into new schools. I don't know how many of y'all watched the news this morning. I was like super jet lagged, so I was up really early. If you watched the Boston local news this morning, what the two of the probably three top stories was, people are nodding their heads because they know, a horrible fight at Revere High School that was caught on tape and a teacher was injured and it was horrific. One of the second ones was a student, I believe a child with special needs, who was left on a bus for like 4 hours yesterday or the day before. And the mother was telling the story of like running up and down bus aisles in like the depot trying to find where her kid was. So as long as that's happening, I will definitely see the potential for the growth of new models. When that's the type of stuff that you're seeing in your kid's school or that's happening to your child, yes, some of these things are a heavier lift, but it feels a bit lighter, I'd imagine. And I know that's not happening everywhere, but some of the problems we're talking about with things like chronic absenteeism and others. I used to be a high school teacher. I feel so, just feel for teachers that are in the classroom right now. If you have a rotating set of students that are absent, trying to move forward with the curriculum, trying to plan a unit, a lesson, et cetera, constantly having to circle back. I mean, so I think those are push factors that are pushing people out of the traditional side. Now, where they land, I don't know. But that's where the pull factors come in. So like, as Lisa mentioned, so we've been asking this question in our polling around the school schedule, where we asked, like, what is the optimum number of days you would like your child to go to school? And we see, across the board, about half of parents say that they'd like the traditional 5-day-a-week model, but usually in the 40s, and it's varied from time to time, in the 40s have said they want some kind of hybrid model. They want something. And then another 10 to 15% say they want to do full-time homeschooling. Interestingly, when we ask teachers this and when we ask teenagers this, which we've done 7 or 8 times, the numbers are all very similar to one another. So it's actually teachers are looking for something like this too. Teenagers, 13 to 18-year-olds are looking for something like that too. So schools that are able to solve those problems, I think that's a sort of pull factor to it. Now, do I think there's going to be a time in which 45-ish% of children are attending some kind of hybrid schedule? I don't. But do I think it can be substantially larger than it is now? I do. So that was a way of like, I feel like I sound like a politician there, watching too many of these debates to not actually give you like a numerical answer. So higher, but I don't know exactly how high.
Lisa.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of room for growth. I agree with Mike, and again, just doubling down on the kind of risk factors that parents, especially if they have fewer children, see. And a lot of it is kind of a contagion or a moral panic, right? Like if there's a school shooting or if people, because schools actually are still probably the safest place for most kids, but still, if the perception is that schools are dangerous or there's bullying or kids aren't learning, which people, a lot of people during the pandemic kind of took a different look at what their kids were actually learning, I think that plays in our favor. So, I mean, I think and I do think like the newest numbers that Angela may talk about on homeschooling and some of the newer numbers that are coming out part of the issue is the data is lagging. And so I think we're certainly still seeing growth, and how high that will go, it may be traditional private schools that benefit, it may be charter schools, but I do think this unbundling of traditional public schools, and they may become a player, like if they're smart, they will join in offering families options, and that's probably the best case scenario.
So Mike, you talked about the size of the market. You really didn't talk about market share. So, and you could argue that homeschooling is at a high watermark, and actually even its market share is about to go down. It's enjoying the reflex from the COVID pandemic and all the safety problems. But public schools are probably going to settle down. They're going to probably strengthen themselves in the next 2 to 3 years, and they're going to feel the force of this competition, and maybe we are at a peak. What do you think?
Is that to Irish, Mike?
This is Mike Petrilli.
So confusing. Well, look, yes, I think that's possible. I mean, I don't know the homeschooling numbers as well as some other people in the room, so I know I have to be careful. I mean, that big spike, yes, I do wonder, how much of that is going to settle down and is what we think of as like real homeschooling versus, the surveys. I don't know. But I think we should. One of the key things I think as we think about it going forward and how this might play out is I hope we can talk about this somewhat differently. Are we talking about elementary school kids? Are we talking about middle school kids? Are we talking about high school kids? Like, I'm glad that, Irish Mike, that you guys asked this question to teenagers. It just seems like these are such different models depending on the age of the kids. And oftentimes, in all of our education conversations, we kind of group it all together. But, like my sense, and, you all know better than I, is that, there's a deep sense right now that high schools in America are broken and that there's not nearly enough options for teenagers who want something different than a pretty traditional college prep comprehensive high school experience. And there's energy, and you hear politicians talking about it, let's make sure there's pathways for careers, but there's actually not a lot out there in terms of capacity. It might be, most estimates would say maybe 2% of high school kids are spending a significant amount of their time doing career tech kind of stuff. And, multiples of that would like to be doing that. So I do think some, new models, you're now talking about kids who can get themselves places with their own car or public transportation. They're old enough to, or hybrid models where they're, home. You're not worried as much about them being home alone as if you're talking about a 5-year-old. I just think this is going to play out very differently than, let's say, elementary schools, where if it's hybrid, it is really the parents needing to play much more of a role than if you're talking about adolescents. So I am curious about that. I hope we can talk about those differences.
Yeah. All right, let's open it up for audience Q&A. I think there are some mics floating around the room. So we've got one here, and I think one back that way as well. But if you raise your hand, we'll bring a mic over to you. Yeah, we've got one right over here. Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. Hello? No. Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciated it. In terms of talking about obstacles to growth, it was very helpful to hear your reflections upon parents' interests, teachers' interests, students, and also the regulatory environment. Something else I was wondering if you were in a position to comment on was teacher pipelines. Do you have a serious concern with teacher pipelines? What do you think are the issues surrounding it? What's needed? So on and so forth. I'd be grateful for your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So I'll just say, I think the whole system, is there a teacher pipeline problem? Yes, right? But I do think that more and more there are these, whether it's like ASU Digital Prep or KaiPod or Wildflower or Microschool Solutions or the National, there's literally dozens and dozens of kind of people whose job it is to incubate new teachers and into these new models. So I think that's a promising thing because it looks different kind of than the traditional, going to a college and then going to a Department of Education. And there's different issues around credentialing. Some of them are fully credentialed and some of them aren't. But I do think the opportunities for educators are broadening, and the kinds of serious people that are offering solutions for educators is really promising. So that's one part of the market that is an abundance versus a scarcity model for teachers. And I think for younger people, that will be very appealing. Does that solve for the larger issue? Are there enough special education teachers in Los Angeles Unified? Probably not. There's still some scarcity in terms of teacher pipeline.
I'll say I actually did a paper about this that came out just a couple months ago. Again, we talk about branding. It's called, the title of the paper was Surfing the Pipeline. Come on. Listen, guys, if it's going to work in any room, it's going to work in this one. Y'all got to help me out here. But part of the research that I did was looking at the states. I think we picked the 4 states with the largest amounts of school choice, looking at all of their educator preparation programs and doing a search for majors, concentrations, minors, courses that would fall into any of these buckets. private schooling, online schooling, micro-schooling, homeschooling, any of those, just kind of keyword searching through all of those. And while, yes, what Lisa said is correct, that there are some places, Arizona State, I think, is doing a great job. There are a couple small places in Florida that are doing things that, compared to the potential need, it is very, very small. Yeah. That there are very, very few places that are offering these things. Though I did just learn today, I think it was Flagler College is now has a new thing in classical education, which is brilliant. I think there's like such an incredible opportunity for institutions of higher education that, as Mike is talking about, are going to be fighting over declining market share. I think of like, you know, if you are the education school at Southwest Missouri State University or something like that, like establishing a center for preparing teachers for some of these new models, if you see that growth happening in your state, seems like an incredible opportunity to take advantage of. So I think there are a few islands where it's taking place. If you look at in the context of all of the programs that exist and all of the students that go through them, they're very, very small. But again, I just think like an incredible opportunity for schools of education to create these programs. And it doesn't have to be a whole major. It could be a minor, it could be a concentration, just offer some courses. Yeah, definitely an opportunity there.
Yeah, go ahead. James Tully.
Thank you. And I share your pain, Irish Mike, for the data because it is so confused. I used exactly the same consulting agency as you did. I'll be reporting data tomorrow morning, and it's very different. But one of the reasons why I asked different questions was because I've been doing some qualitative research as well. I'm wandering around, as Lisa said, wandering around different states in America and coming across this phenomenon of something that looks like a private school, walks like a private school, it sounds like a private school, but it's not. It is in fact it is in fact something that doesn't exist, and the children are actually registered as homeschoolers. So, you know, you see that massive rise in homeschoolers and decline in private schools. So it could be that I've seen so many of these, you know.
Totally.
Yeah. So anyway, that
yeah,
suggested age is confused.
That's the thing. It's like for those of us whose livelihood is dependent on categorizing things and then counting them, could be in for a rough couple of years here. I'm just gonna let y'all know. But you're right, because so many of the lines around these things are blurring. I mean, when you do work around, you know, yeah, any of these types of things, like when is a micro school no longer a micro school? Like when is a hybrid homeschool, you know, go so far that is this homeschooling, but it's or like what's the line between a co-op and a hybrid home, whatever. A lot of these things are blurry, and at some point, the work that we are doing may be kind of somewhat counterproductive, trying to create lines where they don't exist, and just accepting that these are new and different things. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, right over here.
Hi, I'm been running one of those hidden micro schools for the last 15 years, and we are priced like a private school, and in the early days, our landlord, who's a zoning attorney, was like, don't tell anyone you're like a school. And then everyone on the marketing side was, don't use the word homeschooling. So it's been an interesting ride seeing, especially this year, the impact on our enrollment season. So, but my question is, I agree, whoever said, I forget now, that parenting is the big factor in the absentee problem. What is the research being done right now on being a homeschool entrepreneur? I recognize that this is also a bit ironic, but what is being done with the movement to homeschooling, which is exciting, on researching the impact on social, emotional, and life skill development? Because we're seeing so many kids struggling with enmeshment and anxiety and real trauma from school, undoubtedly, but from COVID and technology. So what's happening out in this research? Because I didn't hear any of you mention those three things. Thanks. And also, thank you so much. This is awesome.
That's a good question. I'm trying to think. I know we're going to have a couple panels later that I feel bad if there are people in this room trying to answer that exact question and then I don't give them a shout out. But I don't know. I don't know folks that are working on it. I know folks are working on it, but I can't name them off the top of my head.
Well, if anyone is,
I was going to say.
I mean, I do think that's one of the big, whether you call it a pull or a push to the emerging market, like in surveys that Vela Education Fund has done and stuff that the National Microschooling Center has done, that's one of the like top reasons. Special education and mental health concerns are two of the top reasons that people are seeking out these alternative environments.
Yeah, I think I'd love to be a part of whatever emerging conversation there is, because that's been what we're in the center. I think it's the next big problem.
So, yeah, and if I could just interject. So related to that, because parents seem to be choosing a lot of the emerging school models for so many different reasons, how do you, I mean, you talked about it's difficult to classify. Yes, I'm not even sure a lot of these parents filling out the surveys know how to classify their school accurately.
True.
But the question I have is, how do we evaluate these schools and whether they're delivering or not?
I know Mike will have probably a slightly different take on this than me, but I would say, I mean, I like to use the paradigm of a continuous glucose monitor versus doing your A1C if you're diabetic. I think a lot of these small school environments, and Vela actually just did a survey of all of their members on this very issue, and 30% of them were using standardized tests, not necessarily the state top-down standardized tests, but they were giving their parents. But more than that, they were using day-to-day both evaluation, project-based learning, but also tons of, Zern and Khan Academy and Dreambox, where it's just-in-time data. And right now, like, I have a 4-year-old granddaughter. Do I want to know if she's learning? There's so many ways that I could do just-in-time evaluation, and I think that's put up against, like, we worry about accountability for these measures, but like if you're at Centennial High School in Compton, where 2% of the kids can read at grade level in 10th grade, the next year there's a whole nother cohort of 9th and 10th graders that are still going to that school. And so, I mean, I would argue that we have information from the state about performance, but in terms of like holding anybody accountable when you know they're low performing, I would take just-in-time information to parents from these smaller environments rather than waiting a year to find out, and then what happens to my kid when they go to the next grade if you know that information. And that's my rant, soapbox.
Yeah, and
All
look,
right.
I
Right over
think
there.
that's really well said, Lisa, about how to think about evaluating schools, which is hard. It's hard to figure out how to do it for public schools or for traditional private schools, and I think with these new models, I know we need to be very careful not to squelch any innovation that might be happening. What's tricky is when the public money starts to come in, right? This is my yes, but, right? And I think that it is an argument for being very careful about public money with these new models, especially if it's a model that's a lot about unbundling. It's really hard if you have a model that's an education savings account and you're doing a la carte and you're mixing and matching. I think we have to be honest that there's no logical way that you can actually figure out which of those different pieces might be making the biggest difference, contributing to student learning or the lack thereof. I mean, I've got PTSD from 20 years ago working in the government when we were doing supplemental educational services, part of No Child Left Behind. This was after-school tutoring. It was a complete disaster. And part of the challenge, we very much wanted the model to be, let's hold these providers accountable for results, but give them flexibility. But it was almost impossible to know. Even with 40, 60 hours of tutoring, it's hard to detect the impact on the state tests of that. And if you did detect it, how much credit do you give Sylvan and how much credit do you give the school? So all that said, I think that is an argument against the education savings accounts, at least funded at a significant level. Because I don't know how we can tell taxpayers that we're going to be able to hold these providers accountable for results. Now, a smaller one, maybe something $500, $1,000, maybe something that public school parents get also can be used for enrichment. Then I think you can start having, and we acknowledge that we're just not going to be able to really know the impact on student learning of those sorts of things. But Arizona style, $8,000 per child, and we can't answer whether kids are learning, I find that really problematic.
What about New
And
York
I know that
City,
many of you will disagree.
$40,000 per child? I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, and one last piece on that. No, of course I agree, Lisa. Now, with declining enrollment, we do have an opportunity And it's going to happen. A bunch of public schools are going to close, and it would be insane for those not to be among the lowest performing schools that close. And that is what happened 15 years ago when, as the charter school market share really spiked, you did see some of the worst traditional public schools go away, and that was a good thing.
Thank you, Mike. In the back, way in the back. Yeah.
Thank you for your brilliant sharing. And I love numbers, I love charts. I finished my PhD from the University of Florida like in the year 2022. And I applied for the postdoc position at our program. I was told that year the position was canceled. So I moved to Massachusetts and I work as a vice principal for local boarding school. So I will talk more about the steady decrease of public school enrollment in Florida, because I spent 6 years in researching the education finance in Florida, and my conclusion is the increase of a per pupil education funding doesn't in fact or increase students' academic performance, and I think that partially could explain why we have a steady decrease in the state of Florida. But I started my research in Massachusetts, especially in the Western Mass. This is what I call the forgotten area, because when we talk about Massachusetts, people think about Boston or Worcester, but I'm living in Springfield. So I think maybe for the area in the Western Mass, maybe the conclusion could be the same. I think this is part of the reason that people would choose for the new school model instead of for the traditional public school. However, right now I'm running a school. I do have students just kind of attending my school from like the other countries, and we do have some local students attending the virtual school. But the problem is, this is something I want to share, because I work as a school counselor as well. If our students wanted to go to some top universities, I think the credibility would be an issue. For example, if you choose homeschool, you will not get the recommendation letter. You will not have the academic strengths. You cannot take the high level of courses like the AP courses. I think this is something we have to bear in mind when we think about the virtual school. Yes, we do. We can finish that in 3 or 4 years. But the problem is we lack the credibility from the testing, and my school is using Acellus at Mendham, and we have other online education platform. But the problem, how to monitor the students' progress, is always an issue. And without parents' involvement, virtual school, personally speaking, I don't think it will make a difference than students learn by themselves.
So
thank you.
Do you want to respond to any of that? I was trying to extract a question there, but maybe perhaps the comment about homeschoolers not being prepared for universities.
Well, I think there's sort of two ways of looking at that. One is, are they sort of like academically able to do those things, which I think would be a more contested statement, particularly in this room. I don't know if I'm going to touch that one. But looking maybe a second bit about credentialing and about thinking through those things. Look, I think that that's something that would be great more in the homeschooling world than others. There have already been work to do that, so those things already exist. More is better, right? And if we're going to have more people in homeschooling and more people participating in these, more ways so that those students can demonstrate those things and that are respected by post-secondary institutions and others, like there's no more ain't going to hurt anybody.
Yeah, way in the back.
Thank you. These are great presentations. I love the data and the things that you've put together. I appreciate that. A little bit of background. I homeschooled all 4 of my children all of the way, and they all started university studies when they were 16 years old, and the last thing I would ever want is accountability, because I want to go as fast as I want to go. And I don't want anything holding me back or telling me I can't really go into Euclid when they're 6. You know what I mean? I want to do something else. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. But my actual comment is that, so I teach parenting. That's what I'm known for. I teach at the largest homeschool conferences around the nation because I am known for my parenting. And people have seen our family as a very successful homeschool family. We've been on the BBC and things like that. Anyway, and so what I've noticed as I've been working with families over the years with homeschooling is that the parenting is a massive factor. I know that we don't have the data on that type of thing. I don't even know how you would get it, or if you do have it. And I guess that's one thing I'm petitioning, or that I'm asking, is what do we have on that? Because the parents are feeling very incapable as parents, and our society is making them feel that way, especially with a high emphasis that we put on mental health at the school, that the parents feel like that, oh, am I going to be able to give my child the appropriate social and emotional learning? Never mind the fact that at the school, what's happening there is actually undermining the social emotional learning. And so I think to strengthen our movement, in my opinion, we've got to strengthen the parenting. That's huge, and that's what I work on doing, you know. But I'm just wondering what you've seen in your studies related to parenting and its connection. Are there certain types of parents or people who are more confident in their parenting who have a tendency to go more toward our alternative methods?
Well, I'm going to pick this up and point this to Daniel, because he's done some work on people who've homeschooled their children from the beginning to the end and compared them to those who homeschool for a year or two. What do you find, Daniel?
Yeah, so I think you're talking about the study where I looked at the life outcomes of formerly homeschooled adults who were homeschooled for just a couple of years, or for maybe 3 to 8 years, and then those who are kind of homeschooled all the way through, and looked at are there differences based on income, employment, family formation. And what I found actually is that we didn't find any statistical differences between these formerly homeschooled adults based on the amount of time that they were homeschooled. So what's relevant about that related to your question is maybe that speaks to the parenting part of this, that a lot of the outcomes that we see in children, unsurprisingly, maybe are due to how parents are raising their children to a large extent. And I know that's a shocking finding, but Mike?
Oh no, all I was going to say in sort of response to that is I think it's sort of twofold. You know the research better than I do on this, but sort of reacting the way you put that is, so one response to that of parents feeling this way, feeling that they're not necessarily capable of this, or feeling like they might be overwhelmed, or however you want to phrase it. One is to sort of pep them up and say, no, you're capable of this and you can help this. But another one is to help them. And so I think that, again, as we talk about the growth of these particular models, and if we want to do things that can help these models grow more, I mean, this is a lot of the story of hybrid homeschooling. Many of the ones that we know about started when parents, when their kids were getting older, they were hitting 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, and they weren't comfortable teaching chemistry or physics, and so they were driving all around town to have a chemistry tutor there or a physics tutor over there, and said, hey, listen, can we maybe get together with another couple families and put them in one place? And so that was a way where families still homeschooled for most of the time, but had these supplemental things that helped him out. And again, pointing to some of the data that's there at the end. So I think thinking about those, again, going back to this kind of line blurring conversation, which is having parents be comfortable and open with, hey, we feel comfortable doing this, but we don't feel comfortable doing that. All right, well, let's try and find ways to help you do that. Whatever that is, if it's academic, if it's socio-emotional, if it's whatever it is. So trying to solve their problems in that way.
I mean,
all right,
maybe one last question.
We're going to take one last question. Okay.
I think it's part of the emerging market. Is the providers.
Yeah, right there.
Hello, I'm sorry I'm late, and I heard some of the last conversations about the adequacy of homeschool for preparing kids to maybe the better higher institutes of learning. Okay, so I homeschooled all my kids, and they were invited to come to Harvard, to MIT, because I tested them, and based on their test scores, they were invited to come. Okay, all of them have advanced degrees in technical areas, I'll just say I can't say enough about how good homeschool is in the circles that I have seen. Okay, my primary care physician was homeschooled. A couple of years ago, a few years ago when the pandemic started, and I used to work at NASA, okay, and so some of the NASA parents contacted me, and after a year of being in the pandemic, they said, we're not sending our kids back. They've skipped grades doing homeschool. Okay, so I know a lot of this has to do with the education level of the parents, how much technology they have and all of this stuff. But I think that it's, for me, 30 years ago, it was a non-issue then. And I think that it's a way of giving really superior education, because a tutorial is said to be the most superior form of education. But I, have so many testimonials. I've been out of it for a while, but I just wanted to throw that in, that it's not an issue.
Well, thank you very much for your comment, and thank you all for your kind attention. And we don't want to steal from the other panels, so we shall take a little break here, and then we'll start the next panels on time.
Stand? You want us to stand? Okay. Thank you.
Lisa, but being a tiger grandma, the kid's born, you're worried if they're learning. What is going on? Oh my gosh.
I know I'm a terrible.
Oh my gosh.
I love it.
It's just getting started because they're 3 and 4.
Where are they living?
So they live like 6 minutes from us. So really close. We all did a big family move to Arizona because my son and his wife, they were restaurant managers during the pandemic, and they lost their jobs. They had a new baby, and they were renting a master bedroom for $2,500 a month. And they were able to move to Arizona and buy a brand new 4-bedroom house. So, and they got jobs.
That's great.
Hi.
Hi. Good to see you.
Hi, Karen.
Yeah, of course. It's been a long time.
Centennial High School in Conklin. Yeah, totally. And they lost their